What's going on, beautiful people? What's going on? Good evening, because I'm sure it's late for most people. We are continuing with Reading with Jam. I've decided to name it that because that just makes sense. Reading with Jam. It just makes sense because I'm already reading and I'm trying to practice in public. As I mentioned before, I am a voice actor, content creator. I do a lot of different things. But I figured since I already like to read self-development and nonfiction content, why not take what I'm personally reading and share it with the world? And while doing that, I can practice my narration skills and my voice acting and stuff like that. So I'm sharing content that's enriching to me, and hopefully is enriching to you. And at the same time, I am practicing my craft. I just think that's great. I just think that works out perfectly fine. So right now we are reading Real Artists Don't Starve by Jeff Goins. Timeless Strategies for Thriving in the New Creative Age. We are continuing our reading, picking up in chapter 2. The goal and the hope is I will finish this chapter this evening, and then we'll continue on with the book. It's not that long of a book, actually. And so then we'll jump into another book. But again, we're jumping into Real Artist, or continuing our reading of Real Artists Don't Starve. Timeless Strategies for Thriving in the New Creative Age by Jeff Goins. Thank you again for all of you who have been liking and tuning in and all that. I appreciate it. Let me know. Make recommendations too of books that you may want me to read sometime in the future. I have a long list of books. I have a lot of things on my Kindle. I have a lot of stuff that I'm working on reading. But let me know, even if it's like an article or a short book or something like that, like an essay of something that you want me to read, maybe in one sitting or during one live reading with Jam. I'll consider that. But yes, here we go. Jumping into Real Artists Don't Starve, Chapter 2. Stop trying to be original. The starving artist strives to be original. The thriving artist steals from his influences. To be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child. Cicero. When Sam and Friends debuted on May 9th, 1955, everyone thought they were seeing something new and original. The 5-minute TV spot on Channel 4, Washington, exploded from the screen with playful puppets, exuberant voices, and a sly sense of humor. It was a shocking departure from the subdued format of variety shows of the day. The short skits immediately connected with both children and adults. It was the kind of debut that defied expectations and shocked viewers, pulling the audience into a whole new world. No one had ever seen anything like it. Or had they? The puppet show was the TV debut of college students Jim Henson and Jane Neville, a training ground of sorts for what would later become the Muppets. It was also the culmination of a boyhood dream for Jim, who since the day he begged his parents for television had been hoping for a chance to appear on TV. Now he was seeing his dream come true. Sam and Friends was the young artist's chance to share a new brand of humor with a world that was ready for something more than the traditional puppet show. He and his partner Jane had convinced a local network to take a risk on a couple of unlikely puppeteers who didn't fit the mold, and it was a risk that ultimately paid off. By the end of the series, the couple was making the equivalent of $750,000 a year, and Jim hadn't even graduated college yet. Who can doubt the impact of Sam and Friends? The show would put Jim's and Jane's puppets on the map, leading to what would eventually become an audience of hundreds of millions of fans. And it all started with one big idea. There was just one problem. It wasn't their idea. What audiences thought they saw in Sam and Friends, originality, inventiveness, and innovation, were, in fact, all things that had inspired Jim in his then 19 years of life. Appreciate it. Like every thriving artist, he was not creating something out of nothing. He was stealing from his influences. The Rule of Creative Theft. The historian William Durant once wrote, "Nothing is new except arrangement." Even that quote is not new, however, hearkening back to the biblical line that there is nothing new under the sun. What we perceive as original is often just a rearrangement of what has come before. This is especially true for creativity. According to researcher, I'm going to butcher this name. I'm pretty sure it's Russian. Okay, according to researcher Mihaly Chetskin-Mihaly, creative work is comprised of 5 steps: preparation, incubation, insight, evaluation, and elaboration. What we often think of as creativity is really the final step, elaboration, which requires you to pay attention to several things, including your knowledge of the field and your colleagues, by interacting with others involved with similar problems. Sh- Shesk, this lady, I'm definitely not going to get her name right. This lady wrote, "It is possible to correct a line of solution that is going in the wrong direction and to refine and focus one's ideas." In other words, we create not in isolation, but with the influence of others around us. So forget the flashes of insight and every other myth you've heard. Creativity is not about being original. It's about learning to rearrange what has already been in a way that brings fresh insight to old material. Innovation is really iteration. We learn from those who have come before us and borrow from their creations to make things the world calls original. As Picasso has been attributed to saying, "Good artists copy, great artists steal." Ironically, there are others who have been credited for saying the same thing. Even a quote about stealing is not an original creation. This work we do is not making things out of nothing. Creative work involves pulling together old ideas and offering new insights on them. In a word, stealing, that's what creativity really is. We do not create our way into becoming artists. We rob our way in. You have to steal, actor Michael Caine once said. Steal whatever you see. Today we have countless opportunities to borrow from our influences, both present and past, but how we do this matters. This creative theft is not something you do because you are lazy or undisciplined. Quite the opposite. In fact, the best artists steal, but they do so elegantly, borrowing ideas from many sources and arranging them in new and interesting ways. You have to know your craft so well that you can build on the work of your predecessors, adding to the body of existing work. This was what Jim Henson was doing when he made his TV debut. He had done his homework. Everything he did had been done before in one way or another, but no one had put it together as he had. He stole from the greats who came before him, and in stealing, he made their work better. When the audience of Sam and Friends became captivated by what they thought they were seeing for the first time, they believed the novelty was what made the show a success. But more than that, it was Jim's originality that made the work great. His ability to borrow from so many sources and reassemble them into something marvelous. Who did Jim Henson borrow from? Well, everyone. The puppets came from his grandmother, Sarah Brown, whose sewing skills in the Henson house was unmatched. Her example had inspired Jim to pick up needle and thread at an early age, a skill that enabled him to turn any piece of fabric into a living thing, something that would obviously be invaluable for the rest of his life. The art of puppetry was something he picked up from Burr Tillstrom, the creator of Kukla, Fran, and Ollie. Tillstrom won the admiration of both children and adults with his performances, which involved him standing behind a stage with a curtain to conceal his movements while the puppets acted out the skit. It was a simple arrangement. One Jim would borrow from and adapt to suit his needs. Later in life, he would credit Tillstrom for doing more to bring puppetry to TV than he ever did. And that wry sense of humor came from his mother, Betty, whose wit filled their home with laughter. She would pour a glass of milk for her sons and not stop until they literally said the word "win." Along those lines, the comic strip Pogo taught him how comedy would be at once Along those lines, the comic strip Pogo taught him how comedy could be at once lighthearted and serious. The unique camera angles were lifted from comedian Ernie Kovacs, a deadpan comic with an intuitive sense of how to shoot film for TV. As entertainers were just beginning to learn the new medium, Kovacs was leagues ahead of them, paying more attention to what the at home audience was seeing than what the live studio audience saw. Jim learned from Kovacs that you needed to look through the camera to enter the world of your audience and adapt your performance accordingly. All these influences were absorbed into the work of Jim Henson. What he did was not invent something new, but use what had been done before. This is how creativity has always worked. Of course, we all want to be original. No one wants to be accused of being a copycat. But the starving artist worries about being original, whereas the thriving artist knows that stealing from your influences is how you make great art. This is the rule of creative theft, which says greatness doesn't come from a single great idea or eureka moment. It comes from borrowing other people's work and building on it. We steal our way to greatness. Such an approach wasn't a smart move just for Jim's and Jan's creative work. It was also a sound business strategy. Sam and Friends received enough attention to attract major advertising partners, and soon enough, big brands like Wilkins Coffee and Esky Meats were lining up to pay for their new brand of humor and in-your-face gags. One particular spot featured two of their earliest puppets talking about Wilkins Coffee. In the brief sketch, the cheerful Wilkins asks his friend if he's getting on the Wilkins Coffee bandwagon, and his curmudgeonly companion, Wantkins, says, "Never." He then gets run over by a passing bandwagon. Simple bits like that were earning the puppet-making duo enough money that this side gig of theirs soon became a full-time career. Turns out, it really does pay to steal, when you do it the right way. There was nothing dishonest or illegal about what Jim and Jam were doing. This borrowing of ideas is the kind of theft that thriving artists have been practicing for centuries, and it's what you will have to do if you want your art to make it too. Study the greats who came before. There is an old Irish myth about a 6th century monk named Columcille, who steals a manuscript from an abbot to copy it. When the abbot discovers the theft, he demands the young monk return the original as well as the reproduction. Columcille, Columcille, Columcille refuses, and the case is brought before the High King, who commands the monk to return both documents. This ruling infuriates the monk, who impulsively tells his father, who also happens to be a king. This causes a battle that leaves the abbot dead and the young man plagued with guilt. The young monk is then banished from Ireland, along with 12 companions, and he lives out his exile on Iona, a small island off the coast of Scotland. At Iona, Columcille spends the remainder of his days paying penance through missionary journeys and doing the very thing that got him kicked out of his country in the first place, copying ancient documents. Soon, Iona becomes a center of Celtic Christianity and a refuge of Western culture, one of only a few sites where art and culture are preserved while barbarian hordes destroy much of it, ushering in the Dark Ages. The documents copied by Columcille and his monks are saved from destruction and preserved for posterity, thus rescuing Western culture from near annihilation. But how did they do this? They copied manuscripts of ancient documents which they inherited from the Romans. And the Romans stole much of their culture and art from the Greeks. And the Greeks, of course, borrowed from each other. Sparta from Athens, and vice versa. On and on it goes. This is how cultures are made. You copy what has come before you, and you build upon it. You make it better. I kind of have some thoughts against that, but I'm going to keep reading. There is a secret every professional artist knows that the amateurs don't. Being original is overrated. The most creative minds in the world are not especially creative. They're just better at rearrangement. In order to do that, they have to be familiar with their influences. They have to study before they steal. Yes, before you become an artist, you must become a thief. But even before you do that, you must first become a student. Michelangelo's first commission was a swindle. An art dealer approached him with a request to create a statue and make it look old. The goal was to pass off the work as an original from Roman antiquity, selling it to Cardinal Raphael Riario, the grandnephew of Pope Sixtus IV, and an avid art collector of antiquities. At the time, statues like this were appearing all over Italy. So, from a strategy standpoint, it was a smart move. Hire a talented sculptor to create an authentic looking statue, rough it up, and sell it to the highest bidder. The ruse worked, at least for a while. Cardinal Riario bought the statue, adding it to his collection. However, the deception didn't last long. He discovered the sculpture was fake and returned it to the dealer. What happened next, though, was even more surprising than the forgery itself. The cardinal hired Michelangelo, becoming the artist's first patron in Rome. Riario was not angered by the deception. He was impressed. During the Renaissance, apprentices were taught to copy their master's work so precisely that the copies were indistinguishable from their originals. Being able to reproduce an earlier work was not something to be ashamed of. It was a point of pride. In the words of author Noah Charney, it was a sign of ability, not duplicity, to be able to copy the work of a master artist. So when a young Michelangelo recreated a work from Roman antiquity and sold it to a collector, it boosted his reputation. The great artist knew better than to try to be original. He stole from the past to create the present, and the forgery earned him not only a valuable patron, but a reputation as a great artist. To pull this off, Michelangelo had to possess tremendous patience to study the work of his predecessors and then be able to mimic it so precisely. Such discipline is all but lost in our world today. We are far too impatient, too eager to show the world what we have to offer, too unwilling to take the time to learn the fundamentals of a craft. We would rather create our masterpieces and build our reputations now than endure the tedium of what the masters can teach us. Such an act requires humility, the spirit of a student. But the fact remains that if you want to be great, you must be willing to commit to such efforts. The ability to copy the work of another artist was not necessarily rare at the time of Michelangelo's forgery. The Renaissance itself was a forgery, made possible by the rediscovery of ancient Roman architecture and artwork. Sculptures that were thought to have been lost in the Dark Ages. Great artists of the time were robbing from their predecessors, copying Greek and Roman art forms, repurposing them for a new age. But in that translation, they didn't just copy the past, they built upon it, made it better, and ushered in a new era of art. Today we live in a world we do not deserve, an age that is the product of previous generations' hard work. This is true of every generation, but especially true today, when so many resources and tools are readily at our disposal. Michelangelo and his contemporaries had a similar embarrassment of riches during the Renaissance, but they did not passively receive the opportunities they were given. They recognized and used them. They studied the work of their teachers, mastering their techniques, copying the work that came before, and rearranging it to create something the world would call new. And such is the case for us now, in this new Renaissance. If we want to create work that will stand the test of time, we must honor the legacies we've received. We must become students before we become masters. Begin as a copycat and as a master. Not only should you steal from the masters who came before you centuries ago, you can also copy your peers. That's what Twyla Tharp did. Since 1965, Tharp has been practicing and teaching the art of dance. During her 50-year career, she has created more than 130 dances for the Joffrey Ballet, New York City Ballet, Paris Opera Ballet, London's Royal Ballet, American Ballet Theatre, and her own company. She has also won 2 Emmy Awards, a Tony Award, and the MacArthur Fellowship. Today, she is considered one of America's foremost choreographers. If all this sounds like the work of a creative genius, then you're not getting the whole picture. In 2003, Tharp admitted in her book, The Creative Habit, that she is not as original as people think. She is, in fact, a thief. Everything Tharp teaches, in one way or another, comes from something she copied from someone else. When she started dancing in New York, the dancer dedicated herself to studying every great dancer who was working at the time. She patterned herself after these professionals, learning what she could from them, copying their every move. I would literally stand behind them in class, she said, in copying mode and fall right into their footsteps. Their technique, style, and timing imprinted themselves on my muscles. Tharp understood that honing her dance skills would begin not with an original technique, but by copying what others were doing. She imitated the greats, and after years of study, created a style that was all her own. At least, that's what people thought. That's the power of muscle memory, she wrote. It gives you a path toward genuine creation through simple recreation. The way you establish your authority in a certain field is by mastering the techniques of those who are already authorities. And what eventually emerges over time is your own style. For generations, writers have done something similar in copying the words of their favorite authors verbatim. Hunter S. Thompson did this with the work of his idol, F. Scott Fitzgerald, when he wrote out the pages of The Great Gatsby to get a feel for what it was like to write that way. He also admitted in an interview to stealing more words and phrases from the Bible than from any other source, because he liked the way they sounded. Great artists do not try to be original. They copy the work of both masters and peers, word by word, stroke by stroke. They mimic what they admire until those techniques become habitual. Skill gets imprinted through action, Twyla Tharp said. We create by copying, and as we do, the skill becomes embedded into our memory. When I began my career as a writer, I wanted to find my voice. Whenever I tried to write in what felt like my style, though, it wasn't good. Inevitably, the writing would drift into the voice of whatever book I was reading. For a long time, I thought real writers did something different. They must have been born with innate talent, some style that was just waiting to get onto the page. Turns out, that's not true. We find our voice by mimicking the voice of others. We are all borrowing ideas from someone. As Austin Kleon wrote, a good artist understands that nothing comes from nowhere. All creative work builds on what came before. Nothing is completely original. When we steal like this, we end up creating a style that is all our own. And so, creative theft becomes a gift that we first receive and then give back to the world. This kind of stealing is how an artist remembers for herself and her audience the greatness that has come before. It is a gift to everyone who witnesses your work. Twyla Tharp embodies an important truth about creative work. You are not an artist because you steal. You steal because you are an artist. In her case, she improved on the work that she was borrowing from others so much because she knew she had to create. And intuitively, she understood that she did not yet possess the skill to make it. So she studied, then she practiced, and ultimately she created something that the world had never seen. This is different from the work of a true thief, an unoriginal hack who doesn't know how to pull the work of others into her own routine and make it her own. The difference between an artist and a copycat is that the artist builds on the work she has received, and the copycat only mimics it. Yes, we all start by doing what others have done, but those who master the crafts don't stop there. They keep copying until the techniques become internalized. Then, and only then, can you create something the world calls original. Honor among thieves. There are moral hazards to this, of course, situations to be aware of so we don't misapply this concept of creative theft. At some point, someone will come along who rips off your work and tries to pass it off as his own. But that's not creativity. It's cowardice. How do you create something meaningful and original without being a copycat? There is a code of conduct every thriving artist follows, the right way to steal, and we would be wise to follow it. Creative work requires a careful eye for good work. You have to notice the excellence from which you will steal, and this is easier said than done. We must study the right influences, the ones who are pushing the bounds of what's possible with their craft, the true masters. This is what Jim Henson was doing all those hours staring at the television, watching comedians and puppet masters, while sewing with his grandmother and reading comics. It's what Twyla Tharp did when she mimicked the moves of all those dancers. As you watch and learn and eventually borrow from these influences, remember to do so in a way that honors them. Let your influences know you are learning from them and that they are inspiring you. Help them understand your motive, which is to build on the work, not pass it off as your own. And, as much as possible, cite your sources, giving credit where credit is due. This won't discredit you. It will likely endear you to your influences and your audience. Like Michelangelo, showing your ability to copy others' work will prove that you did your homework. When you steal, don't just copy and paste the work of your predecessors. Once you have mastered the form, bring those influences together in a new way. Curate before you create. If you do this well, you won't be merely cribbing other people's work and passing it off as your own. You will be building on it and making it better. Far too many creatives have gotten lost in the pursuit of originality and never created anything significant. But that's not the way of the thriving artist. When Sam and Friends aired for the final time in 1961, Jim and Jane Henson, who were now married, were perfectly positioned for what would come next. Their career would be filled with more daring exploits, The Muppets, Sesame Street, Fraggle Rock, and a creative legacy for generations to come. Soon, they would find themselves giving back to the world of entertainment from which they had so liberally borrowed years before. But now they would not be the ones doing the stealing. They would be the ones being robbed. Because they dared not to be original and instead built on others' work in new and interesting ways, the world will not forget their work. Creativity starts with stealing, but it does not end there. The creative process, when done right, culminates in something so interesting that others are now compelled to steal from you. That's when you know you've done your job. You are no longer the thief, but the one being robbed. All right. That was the end of chapter 2. Chapter 2 of creativity starts with stealing, but it does not end there. That is the end of chapter 2 of Real Artists Don't Starve by Jeff Goins. Yes. Thank you again for those who have tuned in and who are watching and are supporting Reading with Jam. I'll be back tomorrow or later on today, depending on when you're watching this. I don't know. But I will be back to keep this going with chapter 3 or the next section of the book. Thank you guys again for tuning in. Just want to encourage you, if you have a thing that you're trying to do, whether it's creative or whatever passions or dreams that you got, go for them. Do it. Even if you have to practice in public like this. If that means you go live on Instagram or whatever you do, do it. Because we don't have a lot of time here. You know what I'm saying? And not to say that in a morbid way, but why waste time being afraid? Why waste time doubting? Why waste the potential to have a joy-filled life by not doing the thing? So go for it. Practice in public. I believe in you. You can do it. And I'm probably going to go to sleep now. But you guys have a great night, and I'll talk to you later. Peace.